The TV series Gomorrah, about modern organized crime in the Italian region Campania, where the Camorra clans rule, has fans all over the world. But where did Marzio, the Savastanos, and all those other unscrupulous thugs come from? The story of the Camorra's origins is muddled and shrouded in mystery, as is the organization itself, referred to as a rogue sect. During its heyday in the 19th century, Camorra members were everywhere. They controlled ports, markets, regulated supplies from the suburbs, and set food prices, influenced elections, and caused revolutions. The Camorrists were so powerful that the government of Naples had to turn to them for help on several occasions. The Camorra was born as a prison sect, but because of the 19th century turmoil in the newly born Italian state, it took to the streets and gained power before unheard of. The Camorra would experience ups and downs, later going underground, then regaining power in the region while organizing large-scale showdowns with hundreds of deaths. However, these troubles did not affect it, unlike the Sicilian Mafia, which was like a huge kraken that spread its tentacles everywhere. Camorra was more like a hydra, in which each severed head is replaced by two new ones. This, by the way, is well shown in the show Gomorrah. So if you're curious to how a 19th century prison sect survived and managed to infiltrate almost every sphere of modern Campania, then meet the Camorra on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it, so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance, and enjoy your viewing! Let's start, as always, with their origins. The first serious research on the Camorra was carried out by the Italian government in the 1860s, leading to the most famous version of this society's founding, which is still broadcast in many sources. Let's call it the Spanish version. According to it, the Camorra originated from a 14th century Spanish crime society called Garduña, whose members arrived in Naples at some point in the 16th or 17th century, when the Kingdom of Naples, including Sicily, was part of the Spanish Empire. The evidence supporting this view, however, is very scanty. First, the fact that Camorra is a Spanish word meaning quarrel or fight is usually cited as conclusive evidence, which is certainly true. But the funny thing is, the word came into Spanish from Italian. There's a version with a Spanish velvet camisole called Gomorrah, which the Camorristas were very fond of wearing. But it's not conclusive either. There are many versions with Spanish words in general, but none of them can be called reliable. Secondly, the prison mythology of the Camorra is based on a beautiful legend about three Spanish brothers, Oso, Mastroso, and Carcanoso, who came to Italy to escape persecution. The brothers had killed their sister's abuser and were facing the death penalty in their homeland. Oso settled in Sicily, where he founded the Mafia. Mastroso went to Calabria and created 'Ndrangheta, and Carcanoso reached Campania, where he laid the foundations of Camorra. It's generally believed that it was this motive of revenge by the Spanish knights for their insulted family's honor that formed the basis of the concept of family honor in Italian organized crime. But there's absolutely no evidence for the existence of these brothers. Despite the controversy surrounding the exact origins of the Camorra, the following is beyond doubt. When the Camorra as a phenomenon became entrenched in the official history of Naples, it would follow logically with historical fact. This does not mean that the Neapolitans had some innate biological criminal instinct. No, it's a combination of factors: political illiteracy, economic backwardness, historical altercations from the first half of the 19th century, and the realities of life in this large port city made it possible for the first organized criminal community to emerge within its limits. The city of Naples was the third largest city in Europe for 300 years, from about 1500 to the early 1800s, with a population of about 350,000. Throughout the 16th century, it often rivaled Paris for the title of Europe's second largest city, but by the end of the 17th century, it began to suffer economic hardship due to the failing exports of silk, wheat, oil, and wine, caused in turn by an international economic decline and the emergence of new competitors. Moreover, the plague of 1656 caused 60% of the city's population to either die or leave the city. Despite such disasters, at that time, now after the plague, thousands of people migrated from the countryside to Naples because the city offered job opportunities. Work, however, was in short supply, and the number of destitutes and paupers in the city grew. As the 18th century drew to a close, the rest of Europe and northern Italy were experiencing tremendous economic growth during the Industrial Revolution, while Naples, the capital of the south, was stuck in an almost feudal system, ruled by a monarchy afraid of any innovation. The city's role as capital also meant that it had a large number of unproductive inhabitants. Over a third of the total population was made up of clergy, aristocrats, and the bourgeoisie. 3/4 of southern Italy's trade passed through Naples, with large numbers of people employed in the port, warehouses, and in the distribution of goods. Many people were also employed in serving the aristocracy and middle class. And this is one of the main features of Naples. Throughout the 19th century, its population grew, but population growth did not denote the growth of productivity. Much of Naples' legal business was the resale of goods shipped to the port city. It's likely that the Camorra arose during this period as a result of the collapse of the Neapolitan or Parthenopean Republic, proclaimed in 1799 on the wave of the French Revolution, until 1815 when Napoleon was finally overthrown and the Bourbon dynasty finally established its power. Naples was in political chaos, the voids of which were immediately filled by criminal elements residing in the poorest neighborhoods. After 1815, the middle class began to organize itself into secret societies, such as the Freemasons and Carbonari, and negotiated with the Bourbons. But for the vast majority of Neapolitans who were poor, the Camorra became the only way to show their presence in society. It became a Masonic sect for paupers, and even inherited some of its orders. The rules, oaths, and rituals of the honored society were almost certainly borrowed not from the mythical Gardunia, but from Freemasonry and other Masonic sects. But how could illiterate city bums have adopted the sacraments of high-state sectarians? Masonic organizations were an integral part of politics in the early 19th century. When the French ruled Naples, they tried to recruit the highest ranks of Italians into the Masons to flatter and control them. But Masonic groups later became a center of resistance to French rule and were banned in 1813. At the same time, amid the political chaos, groups of criminal elements began to consolidate with the center of control in the prisons. It was with the prison groups of southern Italy that it all began. The Bourbons, who had wrestled power, were not unreasonably suspicious of secret societies. A Masonic sect of patriots called the Carbonari, which translates to coal miners, infiltrated the army and instigated a failed revolution in Naples in 1820. When the revolution collapsed, many coal miners were imprisoned for a long time, where, of course, they came into contact with the Camorristas, who had not yet developed the sectarian traits. But by the 1830s, 10 years later, they had appeared. That is, the Camorristas from this period had positioned themselves as the elite of the underworld. Thus, an important moment took place in prison, the diffusing spark of a part of the liberal aristocracy outlawed under the Bourbons and the world of southern criminal authorities. Whether the politicians themselves planted Masonic traditions among the prison's governors, or whether the prisoners of high rank wanted to enter such a system, it's now possible to find out. But the fact is obvious. From the 1830s, criminal structures operated with a hierarchy similar to that of the Masons, and they were called the Camorra. In 1836 to 37, in Naples, there was a massive outbreak of cholera due to uncleanliness and unsanitary conditions, killing 20,000 people. Poverty, together with the inability to influence the situation, created real chaos and brought forward the Camorra as a mouthpiece for the crowds of the Neapolitan poor. The Camorra became like a layer between the monarchy and the public, because by the 1840s, it was an established prison structure with its own orders, rules, and code of honor. And such order was at least better than chaos. These were the first signs of the fusion of power with organized crime and the emergence of a pattern where cases were delegated to the Camorra. In the early 1850s, political prisoners from the upper class, liberals who dreamed of unifying Italy and who had tried to revolt in the late 40s, began to reappear in mass in the Campanian prisons, which were under the unqualified authority of the Camorra. One such man was the Duke of Castromeriano, who in 1851 entered the prison of Castello del Carmine, one of the worst in the south. The Duke left a detailed memoir of this, and it's very valuable because up to this point, information about the Camorra's activities in its domain is very scarce, mostly because of the illiteracy of its members, but also because of the political turmoil in Italy. On arrival, the Duke was dressed in a robe and his hands shackled, and the warden led him through stinking corridors to a tiny cell with a single barred window at the top. While Castromediano looked around in confusion, not knowing what was happening, a tall, handsome man in smart velvet pants with a gold watch on his camisole came up to him and returned the wallet he had confiscated at the entrance. In empathetic politeness, the man declared that he was the boss of the Camorra, and they, as freedom fighters of Italy, were exempt from the duties the Camorra imposed on every prisoner, and could count on his full patronage. Also, he added, absolutely everyone in that prison, from the warden to the very last prisoner, was in his complete power. Castromediano later realized that this was a sly move. They shook the money out of him anyway, charging him exorbitant fees for food that was little better than government slop. And that wasn't the only lesson. The Duke's discoveries are interesting for us as well, for he describes the early Camorra in natural conditions, precisely those in which it originated and after the appearance of sectarian traits. The street thieves went to the prison, which under the old government was run almost legally by the most venerable inmates for convenience. Over the previous decades, it was there that the system of that very criminal sect had taken shape. Castromediano began his study of the Camorra in the simplest way possible. He followed the money. And the first thing that struck him was the taxes. They were levied on absolutely everything, down to the last crust of bread and the most pathetic piece of clothing. Prisoners even had to rent a corner to sleep in. In prison lingo, this sleeping space was called a piso. Perhaps not coincidentally, the same word today means bribe or protection fee. Anyone who refused to pay the pizzo was punished. Punishment ranged from beatings to branding with a knife or murder. The Camorra turned the needs and rights of their fellow prisoners, such as their daily bread or piso, into favors, services that somehow had to be paid for. The Camorra system was based on the power to both provide these services and take them away. Castromediano also discovered that the Camorrists called themselves the Honored Society of Naples, and they had their own secret communication system, whose decryption guide was once confiscated from one of the prisoners. This system was accessible only to the highest ranks. Also, the Duke had once witnessed a Camorra trial, which, to his surprise, also had a structure. The Honorable Society didn't just kill the unwanted, it held a real trial. The verdict, however, was published on the wall of the toilet, and the accused knew nothing about it. Sentences were passed not out of justice, but of the code of honor, in the sense that the society understood. Disputes were settled in an unapproved manner, most often by dueling with daggers. Oaths and treaties were to be honored, orders obeyed, and punishment accepted when necessary. According to Castromediano, every day someone was wounded or killed in prison. Mutual hatred, jealousy, squabbles, fights, and stabbings flourished among the Camorristas. There was also the concept of vendetta, a blood feud for insulting the personal honor of a Camorrista. Thus, the Duke of Castromediano described a state within a state. The structure of the Camorra repeated the structure of the state inside the grave gloom of the prison. The same laws, same courts, same taxes, same power of money, etc. In their citizens, the Camorrists encouraged the most basic vices, gambling and drunkenness, which are always the best way to make money. A whole wretched economy existed in the prison corridors. The Camorra was the sole creditor of gamblers and drunks, and in the dungeons you could hear the cries of peddlers selling soiled rags and pieces of stale bread. As the old Camorra saying went, "Facimo caccia di oro de perucci." We extract gold from fleas. In addition, the Camorra also monopolized the market for smuggled goods. The guards also got a percentage on imported books, candles, and clothes, and no item leaked outside without the knowledge of the Camorra. Thus, the prison Camorra had a dual business model designed to extract gold from fleas, extortionate taxes on the one hand, and smuggling trade on the other. Also at the time, Castromediano noted that Naples prisons housed bandits from all over the south who called themselves Camorristas. However, the Duke noticed differences in the dress code adopted by Camorristas from different regions. The Sicilians tended to favor a black velvet look, while the Neapolitans dressed in bright colors with the obligatory gold accessories and fez cap. There was irreconcilable enmity between the Calabrians and Neapolitans, while the Sicilians usually kept neutral, but if they took sides, a terrible massacre would ensue. However, despite all the enmity and differences, future Sicilian mafiosi, Neapolitan Camorristi, and Calabrian Ndrangheti, by the middle of the 19th century, called themselves members of honored societies. Their shared vocabulary is a sign of their common origin in the prison system, within the kingdom of the Two Sicilies. But what Castromediano could not have known while in prison was that the Camorra at the time had already taken its first steps out of the dungeon and onto the streets. In the 1850s, despite all the repression from Bourbon rule, demands for change continued. The economy of the South continued to grow slowly, and the vast majority of goods passed through Naples. Grain exports increased sixfold between 1838 and 52, and fruit exports also doubled between 1832 and 59. The port of Naples now handled huge volumes of trade. In 1855 to 59 alone, the port doubled its activity. The Camorra, of course, took an assiduous part in all matters. Not only did it make money from gambling, stealing, and pimping, but it also received levies on goods that came into the port and passed through the city gates. The amount they took could often be as much as 10% of the value of the goods themselves. They also controlled the supply of food to the city, and there was a liaison between the village Camorristas and the city Camorristas. The villagers lived in small towns around Naples and ruthlessly robbed farmers on their land or on their way to the city. At the entrances to the city, the fiefdom of the Camorra was already beginning. In addition, the Camorristas replaced police in the poorest neighborhoods. The lawmen did not want to go to the most dangerous areas and trusted the Camorra to restore order. Even then, members of the society had a kind of political carte blanche, which extended to the most criminalized areas. The economic growth of Naples occurred as if against the policies of Ferdinand II. Most goods and capital came from Germany, France, or Switzerland. Tariff barriers discouraged new investment and methods of production, and many of the middle class depended on the administration's old system of employment, based on the family principle. Throughout the reign of Ferdinand II, Neapolitan society was highly unstable. The poor were left to fend for themselves and could only rely on the Camorra, thus increasing its influence. It's known that the urban Camorra in Naples consisted of various branches, sometimes called lodges, one for each of the 12 quarters of the city. However, its main power was concentrated in the 4 quarters of the lower city, in the slums of Naples. The Capo Camorristas, or Capo Sociata, of each ward was elected by his peers. The position next to the capo was held by the cantorulo, or bookkeeper, who was charged with the task of collecting and redistributing the society's money. Each district had its own boss, or capentriti, and many petty leaders, or piccioti gangs. The lowest rank carried the title of picciotto di scoro. The main rule that applied to all was the law of omerta, eternal silence when communicating with the authorities, as well as a complete and categorical ban on any communication and joint activities, even with former representatives of the judiciary and the army, be it demoted soldier or dismissed judge. Anyone aspiring to become a member of the Camorra had to prove that they met the society's criteria. For example, there was a ban on passive homosexuals, and applicants whose wife or sister was an active prostitute. Candidates for membership also had to be tested and observed by their superiors in the society. They could be required to commit murder or inflict a disfiguring cut on the face of an enemy. These mutilations, called sfregio, were used as punishment for both outsiders and Camorristas who broke the rules. They became the most conspicuous sign of Camorra power in the slums of Naples. Once a new member was deemed ready, he had to take an oath on crossed knives and fight a duel at daggers with a Camorrista chosen by popular vote. If the recruit proved his bravery, he became picciotto di scorio, meaning a lad who is ready to fight, and had a thorny road ahead of him to become a full-fledged Camorrista. Becoming a Camorrista meant gaining access to decision-making power within the society and a greater share of crime proceeds. The hierarchy within the Camorra was based on a single principle: exploitation. Camorristas ruthlessly exploited their junior piccioti di scorio. The life of a lad ready to fight was described as full of hard labor, humiliation, and dangers that had to be endured in the hope that at some point he would be made into a Camorrista. One common test of the character of picciotto di scorio was to accept guilt for a criminal offense committed by a high-ranking member of the society. 10 years in prison was the price to pay for the chance to become a Camorrista. However, the ranks of the Camorra was flexible. There were no definite terms. Members of the sect overwhelmingly could not read, and therefore there were no written laws in the honored society of Naples. All customs and orders were passed down orally, varying according to the time and place, the will of the superiors, and decisions made at meetings, and they were often circumvented in a legendary way, which in fact became a trademark of the Camorra. Knife fighting, which was an important element of the initiation rites, served as a mechanism for resolving disputes between Camorra members, and was a tool to promote hierarchical growth in the organization. That is, the most brazen and skillful picchioro de sigaro could quickly rise through the ranks by challenging and defeating his seniors in duels. Knife fights were a special culture of the Camorra, so it's worth talking more about them. In addition to being a means of promotion by fairly defeating an opponent, the knife fight served as a jousting tournament and a demonstration of fearlessness and contempt for pain. Knife and dagger became the main weapons of the Camorristas, not only because they were ideal for concealed carry, but also because of their classic principle, memorable since the times of ancient Rome: the shorter the weapon, the braver the owner. These duels, which fulfilled so many functions, were called sumpata. The origin of the term sumpata comes from the word sompo, meaning leap or jump, a dialectal variant of the Italian for somersault. In the slums of Naples, knife fighting was taught from childhood with wooden models or just sticks, and continued in the prison's criminal universities. Beginners were taught by masters, usually picchiori or experienced camorristas, who explained to young gangsters how to attack and defend themselves according to all the rules of swordsmanship. The Camorran code of chivalry forbade the participation of the organization's highest ranks in these duels: capo societa and capentriti while in office, former Camorristas and Camorra members over 60 years old, and it also forbade the challenge to honor duels of police informers, passive gays, and those Camorristas who allowed their mothers, sisters, or sons to engage in prostitution. In addition, without the approval of the capo societa, the rules also prohibited challenging members of the community who were lower in the Camorra hierarchy to a duel. History has preserved the names of some of the masters of the sumpata. Perhaps the most famous was the legendary capo societa of the 1840s, Agnello Arciello, who earned the unspoken title of King of Sumpata. Arciello was in the business of buying up Bourbon army assets, mostly horses, and literally wiped out anyone who was outbid at auction, creating a monopoly in the horse market. He also managed to instantly rise up the career ladder and immediately become a capo societa, passing the step of capentriti. To do so, he challenged the capentriti of 4 districts to a knife duel on a far-fetched pretext and defeated them all. But soon Arciello was accused of violating the rules of the Camorra. He appointed his bodyguard, a former soldier, as treasurer of the organization. In addition, he was also accused of selling weapons to bandits on the country roads, which was also forbidden by the rules, and as a result, was removed from his post. Arciello then summoned his successor to the sumpata. But since the rules of the Camorra prohibited the capo societa from participating in the sumpata, his summons were rejected. Immediately afterward, Arciello disappeared from Naples, and his traces were lost. But what's even more interesting, his wife declared herself a widow and demanded her husband's share in the traditional way, challenging the wife of the new boss to a duel on spadea de Genova, or Gitney skewers, the weapons used by women Camorristas, but the fight for some reason did not take place. And here we should mention another interesting point from the honored society of Naples. The women of Camorra had almost equal rights of men. After the death of a spouse, the wife could claim not only his money, but also his status. There were even women's groups and a separate kind of female knife fighting. But all this applied only to decent women. The Camorra was the only one of the honored societies that openly pimped and ran brothels, and generally had a very tolerant stance on the matter. There was a special word for bandits engaged in such business, ricotari, and prostitutes who belonged to the Camorra were marked with a scar on the cheek. Another curious fact is that being a prostitute did not mean one could get out of the business if successfully married to a Camorrista. These women simply stopped working and were reinstated. And, it must be said, women played no small part in the coming events that literally changed the history of not only the entire Camorra, but of Italy as well. So, by the end of the 1850s, a powerful criminal organization had formed in the Neapolitan ghettos with its own laws and extensive businesses. The Camorra literally ruled the lower city with little regard for official authorities. But in May 1860, Giuseppe Garibaldi landed in Sicily, and the campaign to unify Italy began. The end of the old Bourbon regime was not far off. In the summer of that year, Naples learned that the Garibaldians had consolidated their power in Sicily and were preparing to invade the Italian mainland and move northward. On June 26th, Neapolitans learned what actions the Bourbon monarchy was planning in response to the invasion. Posters were hung on the walls of houses proclaiming sovereign law, in which King Francesco decreed that the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies should cease to be an absolute monarchy and change to a constitutional monarchy. A government composed of liberal patriots had already been formed. An amnesty was also declared for all political prisoners, and the flag would consist of the Italian tricolor of red, white, and green, topped by the coat of arms of the Bourbon dynasty. It soon became clear to the inhabitants that Garibaldi's expedition had put Francesco in a hopeless position, and the Bourbon state was beginning to falter. The day sovereign law was published was a dark day for Naples' police forces. For years, the police had been feared and despised as a corrupt instrument of repression. Now they found themselves politically unprotected when almost certainly a battle for street control could break out any minute. On the evening of the day sovereign law posters appeared, groups of people from the poorest alleys went to Toledo Street to boo police officers. Shopkeepers pulled down their shutters and expected the worst. They had good reason to be afraid. Mass riots were a regular occurrence in Naples and were always accompanied by looting. Serious trouble began the next day when two crowds, royalists and patriots, gathered in the streets chanting slogans. A certain Mariana de Crescenzo, nicknamed Saggio, was particularly prominent among them. One report described her as dressed like a brigand, adorned with ribbons and flags, with a company of similarly dressed women waving knives and pistols. Bourbon supporters suspected that Sangiovanara had provoked the riots by distributing cheap booze from her tavern and was also active in subversive propaganda. De Crescenzo, a key figure of the summer riots of 1860, was the owner of a wealthy tavern in the city center, and, by coincidence of course, a cousin of the then Camorra boss Salvatore de Crescenzo, whom I will discuss a bit later. Mass riots were beginning in the streets, crowds were pushing through the police, 2 people were killed, and only the arrival of a cavalry unit prevented the situation from deteriorating further. It seemed to everyone that this was only a taste of the terror to come. Fearing the worst, the cavalrymen and policemen fled Naples that day, saving themselves. There was now no one to confront the mob. Armed to the teeth, organized gangs took turns breaking into each of the city's 12 police stations. They broke down doors, threw files and furniture out the windows, and constructed huge bonfires in the street. The Naples police ceased to exist. But by noon, to everyone's surprise, there was a peculiar calm. Yes, the bandits did beat up some of the police officers they had caught, but instead of lynching them, they handed over the officers to the army. There was cheering, laughter, and dancing around bonfires near the stations, and street boys cut up police uniforms and handed out pieces of them as souvenirs. It didn't look like a riot against the monarchy, but like a general celebration. But the most unexpected thing was that there was no looting. Slum rioters handed over the money and valuables they found to army officers or parish priests. Groups of poor people even walked the streets and urged merchants to open stores, assuring them that they just wanted to drive out the Bourbon police, not loot anything. These were very strange days, but soon events took a fantastic turn. The evening before the attack on the police stations, King Francesco II hastily appointed a new head of police, a lawyer named Liborio Romano. He was indebted to the Bourbons. In the early 1850s, he, like all patriotic liberals, had been thrown into prison. But for health reasons, the 60-year-old Romano was released on an oath of allegiance to the monarchy and allowed to return to Naples. And now it was time to pay his debts. He was entrusted to lead the police, and it was his most difficult job yet. A few hours after taking office, Romano launched one of the boldest initiatives in the department's history. He offered the Camorra a chance to rehabilitate, in his words, by replacing the police. The bosses of the Honor Society readily accepted the offer, and soon Camorristas began patrolling the territory with cockades, colored ribbons in the red, white, and green colors of the Italian flag pinned to their jackets, on their chests, or on their caps. As a result, Naples remained unplundered, and Liborio Romano became a hero. July 23rd, his Saints' Day was celebrated with illuminations and a lantern parade. Romano's policies were so successful that many Camorristas were later recruited into the National Guard. The risky summer between the fall of the Bourbon regime and the arrival of the Garibaldi passed as peacefully as anyone could have imagined. The Camorra's prominent role in this Neapolitan drama made the news in Turin, Italy's new capital. One magazine even marked the occasion by publishing portraits of the Camorra bosses. One of them, Salvatore de Crescenzo, I have already mentioned, and he's an important character. Born in 1822 to a family of shoemakers, he was first convicted and sent to prison in 1849 for grievous bodily harm and suspected of murdering another prisoner later that year. He spent the 1850s in prison, getting out only briefly, and his last arrest before his portrait appeared in the press was in November 1859. De Crescenzo was also known as a master of Sampara, and is now a true folk hero. And while Garibaldi was working wonders of patriotism in the south, having conquered an entire kingdom with the help of a handful of volunteers, in Naples it seemed from the outside that a miracle had taken place even before his arrival, of which the newspapers wrote the redemption of the Camorra. The crime bosses have realized the unrighteousness of their path. However, where crowds, organized crime, and politics intersect, there can be no miracles, at least not for free. In fact, the deal between the liberal patriots and the Camorristas against the Bourbons was struck long before Garibaldi's arrival. Several years before the liberation began, a group of patriots had secretly arrived in Naples with the goal of overthrowing the Bourbon monarchy. Many of these conspirators joined an underground organization called the Committee of Order, and in the mid-1850s a secret pact was made between the Movement for Unification of Italy and the Camorra. The patriots knew Naples well and knew that without the support of the Camorra, and thus the mobs, any political revolution would fail. However, not all patriot leaders agreed with this tactic, nor did all Camorristas. But word leaked out to the Bourbon police, who were themselves thoroughly Camorrista, that the boss, Salvatore de Crescenzo, was among those who were bent on the deal. According to witnesses, things did not go well at the first meeting between the conspirators and the shady bosses. First, the Camorristas spoke harshly to the well-dressed patriots about ignoring the needs of the poor and indicated that they would not help them reap the fruits of the revolution alone. After that, the Camorristas got down to business. To provoke a patriotic revolt against the Bourbon monarchy would require money, a lot of money. To start, they demanded a reward of 10,000 ducats for each of the bosses. According to very rough modern estimates, they demanded $170,000 from each boss to help overthrow the Bourbon state. Nevertheless, the patriots, gritting their teeth, agreed to the terms of the honored society, and payments began to come in regularly. However, preparations kept dragging on and did not enter the active phase. The cunning bosses preferred to blackmail the patriotic conspirators, threatening to tell the Bourbon police everything if they were not given more money. Things looked very grim for the patriots in Naples when, in 1859, the situation suddenly changed with the completion of the first stage of Italian unification in the north. This changed the rules of the game somewhat. The war between the police and the Camorra entered a new stage and mass roundups in its neighborhoods began. Many of the Camorristas, including Salvatore de Crescenzo, were sent to prison islands off the Italian coast in late November of 1859 as a result of this confrontation. The alliance now looked not only like an excuse for blackmail, but also a very promising deal. Garibaldi's invasion of Sicily the following May and the issuance of the Sovereign Act brought the situation to a climax. As you may recall, the act proclaimed amnesty for prisoners, and the released bosses were itching for revenge against the police. The reason the armed mob that attacked police stations showed such remarkable self-discipline was that almost all of them were Camorristas who had made deals with the patriots a few years earlier. La Sangiovanara was a key figure. It was in her tavern that the secret meetings took place, and it was she who helped the patriot prisoners smuggle messages out of Bourbon prisons. And Liborio Romano had the most direct links with the Camorra. First, his father was part of the Carbonari, those same Masons from the 1820s, and was imprisoned for his beliefs. And secondly, Romano himself was arrested for political reasons. Not for long, but still. So it's likely that Romano and the Honor Society were working hand in hand from the beginning, and together planned the downfall of the Naples police and their replacement by Camorristas. Ultimately, the exact details of the agreement that was undoubtedly made between the bandits and the patriots are irrelevant. As events in Naples would soon prove, a pact with the devil is a pact with the devil, no matter what the fine print says. The last king of the Bourbon dynasty left Naples September 6, 1860, and the next morning Garibaldi already faced a jubilant crowd at a train station, among which here and there one could spot velvet camisoles and sparkling gold chains. Liborio Romano shared in Garibaldi's fame. A great friend of the Camorra was the first to shake hands with Garibaldi on the platform of that Naples station. The two of them later boarded a carriage and together they drove through the cheering crowd, accompanied by a convoy of Camorristas shooting into the air, wearing tricolor cockades. A provisional authority was then set up in Naples to rule the Garibaldi's name, while he annexed the rest of the kingdom. For the Camorra, this was a real starting sign. The coveted cockade, obtained in the summer of 1860, became a state license for extortion, and once the provisional government was in place, they did not need to hide their true motives. Once they were made policemen, for a time they stopped being Camorristas and became the real saviors of Naples. But when things got back to normal, they turned back into Camorristas, without ceasing to be policemen. Smuggling and racketeering became more profitable than ever. The Camorra literally took over the entire city. All entrances, exits, ports, and markets, everything coming into the city was controlled by them. From pork goods from Africa to cheese from the nearest suburb. The government's customs revenues collapsed. In one day, the legal customs officers collected only 25 soldi, enough to buy a few pizzas at the nearest eatery. The Camorra also found new spheres of influence. After the arrival of Garibaldi and the establishment of provisional government, tens of thousands of people felt unprotected. Crowds of petitioners of all sorts rushed to the state offices. They were so numerous that ministers and administrators had to push through the corridors. And at the beginning of the line at the officers' doors always stood Camorristas, deciding who could go to apply for a job, a contract, or pension. In fact, some ministers were surrounded by Camorristas at court hearings. Among some ministers was undoubtedly Liborio Romano. The Camorra hadn't had such authority, even under the Bourbons, but their prosperity could not last forever. On October 21, 1860, the people of Naples voted amicably to become part of the Kingdom of Italy. Shortly thereafter, Garibaldi's plebiscite relinquished his temporary dictatorship and handed over the appalling mess that Liborio Romano had created to the provisional authority that governed the integration of Naples into Italy. The man credited with solving the police crisis in Naples was another southern Italian patriot, also a veteran of the Bourbon prisons, named Silvio Spaventa. The incorruptible Spaventa, who served nearly 10 years and was released only in 1859, wanted nothing to do with the Camorra. And while Liborio Romano's mild rule made him a favorite of the lower city, Spaventa's brutal repression made him hate it. The first mass arrests of the members of the Naples Honor Society took place as early as November 16, 1860. Large quantities of weapons and police uniforms were seized. Salvatore de Crescenzo, a favorite of the press, was returned to prison. There, he would continue his ascent to the top of the Camorra hierarchy. And 2 years later, on the morning of October 3, 1862, on the very doorstep of Vicar's prison, De Crescenzo would be murdered by his adversaries. But even while De Crescenzo was in lockdown, the Camorra was not about to surrender to Spaventa's onslaught. On the night of November 21, 1860, the Camorrists attacked the building in hopes of freeing their superiors from their cells. Spaventa responded with an even harsher series of searches and arrests over the New Year's holiday. In January 1861, there was a street protest against him. A petition with several thousand signatures calling for his dismissal followed. Ignoring his unpopularity, Spaventa responded with more arrests. But what irritated the Camorrists most of all was that Spaventa forbade National Guardsmen from wearing uniforms when they were off duty. For criminals who infiltrated the National Guard, this prohibition meant that it was impossible to use the power of police uniforms for extortion. Retaliation swiftly followed. On April 26, 1861, an angry mob of several dozen Camorristas stormed the ministry building shouting, "Death to Spaventa!" An officer was then killed in his place, but he managed to escape. The next day, he appeared in a busy cafe and went to the premiere of a play, demonstrating that he was not afraid of the Camorra, but he would still learn a few lessons. 3 months later, incorruptible Spaventa got into an extremely unpleasant, but at the same time typical, Neapolitan situation. Near his home there was a murder of a policeman who everyone knew had ties with the Camorra. The murderer was quickly found. His name was De Mata and was quickly released with the help of an influential person. And that influential person turned out to be, yes, Silvio Spaventa. De Mata was a member of Spaventa's personal guard. It was rumored that Spaventa used him to intimidate the editorial offices of politically dangerous newspapers and beat up uncooperative journalists. So it seems that even the incorruptible Spaventa had fallen foul of Neapolitan mores. Obviously, the Honored Society learned an important lesson from everything happening during the crisis of the Bourbon regime and the founding of a united Italy. The lesson of how to find the most corruptible politicians. It should be noted that during this period, the Camorra failed to integrate with the state, and it remained a state within a state, This was largely due to their greed and fragmentation. The old administration, choosing between the fines of the tax authorities and the threats of the Camorra, always went along with the criminals, while the new politicians from the north did not want to accept the state of affairs. Spaventa was the first in a line of many who tried to fight the Camorra in its fiefdom. However, they never succeeded in getting economically involved in politics the way their Sicilian brethren had. The government didn't rely on their investments to keep the economy going, and they didn't have the know-how to lobby their candidates. The Camorra's main business and profit remained all kinds of illegal: extortion, gambling houses, and prostitution. It was unable to come out of the shadows of the 19th century. This fact helped to contain the growth of the Camorra, but it was still too strong to be completely destroyed. The period after Italy's unification represents the second phase of the Camorra's existence, which lasted until about the beginning of the 20th century and is characterized by the steady advance of the Camorra into many areas of Naples society. During this half-century, Naples and South began to fall further behind the rest of Italy. A flood of goods from France and Britain spilled into the market, bankrupting local producers whose prices were artificially inflated. Taxation also doubled, but most of the taxes collected and capital accumulated were earmarked for investment in the North's booming industry. Poverty remained widespread, and cholera outbreaks occurred in the cities. There was still a dense gang network in the prisons, which remained a breeding ground for crime. The authorities did little to recognize the penitentiary system, and it was from the penitentiaries that fresh blood was regularly supplied to the Camorra. During this period, the Camorra began to develop new economic zones, for the first time taking a direct path in the resale of horses, and increasingly infiltrating the high society in its favorite way, sowing the seeds of addictive pleasures. The gambling houses became more and more private and sophisticated, the whores more expensive and beautiful, and the Camorristas themselves now tried to dress like decent people. If in the 1860s their velvet camisolas, gold chains, scars, and tattoos served to intimidate, then by the end of the century, Camorristas of high rank were no longer distinguishable from respectable citizens. They hid tattoos and tried not to show battle wounds. The economy of Naples was increasingly dominated by municipal contracts to restore many of the city's oldest neighborhoods, the money from which ended up in the bottomless pockets of politicians and their criminal buddies, and was the actual cause of cholera outbreaks, a disease brought on by unsanitary conditions. Also notable in this respect is the cab drivers' strike that took place in August 1893. The crowd's anger was aroused by a proposal to expand the city's streetcar network, and 3,000 taxi drivers began a violent street protest that coincided with patriotic demonstrations against the murder of several Italian workers in the south of France. They were soon joined by socialists, anarchists, and a hungry crowd from the lower city, and clashes with the police broke out, during which an 8-year-old boy was accidentally killed. The army was called in to establish order. The true cause of the riots was certainly not the righteous anger of honest laborers. There were many Camorristas among the drivers who in turn had many politician friends. And these politicians had some questions for the central government in Rome. First, the fat streetcar contract that the Northerners wanted to give to the Belgians for some reason instead of the respected Neapolitans, and second, they were threatened with the loss of control over the slum reconstruction program that had begun just after the cholera outbreak. So once again we have a familiar pattern. Some particularly greedy politicians make a deal with those who controlled the masses. And it should be noted, they won again. The riots and the boy's death forced Rome to make concessions. At first, the cabbies were told that there would be no streetcar reform. After everyone had dispersed, the original plans were restored to exactly what Naples needed. A Belgian consul had already traveled to the south. Funding for the endless slum redevelopment was continued, and the Camorra was happily rubbing its hands together, getting its share of all the contracts. But the 20th century was coming. Italy was entering a very different era. A centralized banking system had emerged, and rapid industrialization had begun. In Turin, Fiat began manufacturing cars in 1899, and Pirelli began producing car tires in 1901. Over the next few years, Italian cities were filled with noise and light from automobiles, electric streetcars, department stores, bars, movie theaters, and soccer stadiums. In politics, reforms were the order of the day. More and more people became literate and were given the right to vote. The Socialist Party, though still small, was strong enough to win concessions in Parliament. In 1913, Italy would hold its first general election, in which by law all adult males had the right to vote. There was also a revolution in the media. Newspapers popped up like mushrooms after the rain. Their circulation increased, and journalists began to search for sensations and sniff out secrets. For the Camorra, this was a real challenge. As you may remember, it had been kept alive by the fact that most of its members were illiterate and believed unquestionably in the tales of the brothers Osso, Mastroso, and Carcognoso. Told by senior ranks, the Honor Society of Naples was about to face a battle in a more organized and democratic society, where public opinion shaped the political decisions that determined the fate of criminals. Another of the fateful circumstances was the emergence of a full-on socialist party. The liberals had never tried to appeal to the politically illiterate poor masses by targeting a different class, but the socialists started to take all the slum's attention from the Camorra. Without its knowledge, large street demonstrations of workers began to take place, and social publications cried out for condemnation of the rotten corrupt system. After the cabbies' uprising, the attention of all Italians turned to the Camorra, so in 1900 a commission from Rome, headed by Giuseppe Cerreto, came to Naples to investigate the murky southern affairs in September 1901. Cerreto presented a 200-page report which should be described in detail. The prosperity of the Camorra, according to the inspector, was due to the fact that officials were preoccupied with fighting for position rather than caring for the residents. The Camorra, in his opinion, was divided into high and low ranks. The low ones were illiterate inhabitants of the 4 districts, but the high ones were a new phenomenon. In the 40 years after unification, a whole generation of smartly dressed Camorristas had grown up on contracts and social clubs, and their own network of high society, offering all kinds of services. In absolutely every sphere of society, there were Camorra proxies who had to be paid, just as they had once paid for air to breathe and a mattress in the corner of a cell. Their report had a bombshell effect and sparked heated discussions in the community, highlighting the problems at hand. And if before only the streets of Naples knew what a scar on the left cheek of a dashing young man meant, now all of Italy understood that it was not from falling off a horse as a child. Moreover, at that moment, not only the sectarian mystique taken from the Camorra, the socialists also took away its main process, the influx of picchiotto di sicario. The process began with the mass exodus of Italians from the country. From 1900 to 1906, about 400,000 people left Naples alone. Those who remained were still illiterate. 42% of adults in Naples could not read, according to the 1901 census. But industrialization, which had reached the South, gave them stable employment and trade unions, which they had the opportunity to vote for the socialists instead of the Camorra, who promised not fear and fees, but status and real solutions. But the final point in this phase for the Camorra was set by the Cuocolo trial, which New York newspapers dubbed the next trial of the century. On the morning of June 6, 1906, the police broke into an apartment on Via Nardones in downtown Naples. There they found the body of a former prostitute named Maria Cutinelli, who had died of 13 stab wounds. Police immediately suspected a crime of passion and promptly began searching for the victim's husband, Gennaro Cuocolo. Cuocolo was found the next day, but he too was dead, with 47 stab wounds, and his skull fractured with a baton. It was clear from the nature of the wounds that the Camorra committed the murder. It turned out that Cuocolo was indeed a former member of the Honored Society, and his wife had once worked in one of the Camorra's port establishments. Almost immediately, the suspects were found. 5 top officials, including Erriconi, or Big Enrico, the Camorra's supreme boss at the time. But there was no hard evidence against them. Multiple witnesses confirmed that on the night of Cuocolo's murder, the 5 had dinner at a restaurant a couple hundred meters from the murder scene. Erriconi and his friends went free almost immediately after their arrest, to the great indignation of the Neapolitan public. The Carabinieri took over the case, and by the beginning of the following year, they had found a valuable informant. He was a young horse trader, an inveterate thief, and Camorrist named Gennaro Marzio. He wasn't the first Camorrista to break the Omerta code, but he didn't just violate it, he literally gutted the entire Camorra system to the investigators and the public. He told the Carabinieri that Cuocolo had been sentenced by the Tribunal of Honor Society for violating their sacred code. Cuocolo, a fence for stolen goods, had ordered a certain Luigi Arena to commit a robbery, and when Arena brought the valuables, Cuocolo turned him in to the police. Arena, from a colony on the island of Lampedusa, wrote a letter to a senior Camorrista demanding justice. At the tribunal, Cuocolo was sentenced to death, and it was up to Big Enrico to carry out the sentence. He hired 6 assassins who sent Cuocolo and his wife to the other world. Marzio himself knew all this because he served as a messenger to Erricone and personally saw how, after the case, the killers brought the boss bloody jewelry from Cutinelli's apartment. The case gradually grew in detail and procedural complexity. More and more new suspects appeared in it, but whose existence seemed incredible. And no, they were not street bums, but respectable, referential, and even famous people in the city, who, as it turned out, provided loans to the aristocrats who had lost everything to dust, took over the horse market, and received interest from almost every transaction in the city. The lofty Camorra appeared before the public in all its glory. The press even gave them a special designation, killers with beige gloves. Gloves were a symbol of the bourgeoisie. Not surprisingly, it eventually took 4 years and 9 months of investigation and legal preparation to bring the Camorra to justice for the murders of Gennaro Cuocolo and Maria Cutinelli. In 1908, a devastating earthquake struck southern Italy, briefly diverting attention from the case. Some 80,000 people died, and the survivors began to migrate en masse to the New World. Finally, in March 1911, in Viterbo, a small town between Rome and Florence, the Cuocolo trial began. Marzio spoke, and his every word was greedily grasped by crowds of journalists. He talked so much that Big Enrico spitefully nicknamed him the gramophone. Meanwhile, Enrico's own style of speech also became a sensation. He was a charming and eloquent man, not at all as one might imagine a boss of the Camorra. In total, about 800 witnesses were questioned, and the process was very tense and long, with fights, insults, and constant delays. But on July 8, 1912, 41 that were accused of the case of the Cuocolo murder were called back to the crowded Viterbo courtroom to learn their fates. They were collectively given more than 4 centuries of imprisonment. Remarkably, after the Viterbo trial, the Camorra, as an organization that existed even before the unification of Italy, virtually disappeared. Somehow, Gennaro Marzio and the judicial precedent he helped put an end to the history of the Honored Society of Naples. The investigation finally revealed just how strong the bond between the police and the Camorra had been. But this time, the cops began to testify against their former buddies, and this strong bond was the most truthful testimony of all. Most of the officers interviewed claimed that the Camorra, as everyone imagined it, was a thing of the past. Its sectarian principles of brotherhood and the Code of Omerta no longer worked in the modern world. The Camorra was gradually turning into disparate factions, where the law was the strongest man wins. Blind obedience to elders just because they were elders was gone. No, the Camorristas continued to do what they were doing, to roof, extort, run brothels, but they did it independently of each other, entering into coalitions based on territoriality or fighting on that principle. The Camorra as a system was virtually non-existent by the time the Cuocolo verdict was announced. Erricone was the last to try to revive the Honored Society of Naples along old lines. After his arrest, the whole thing fell apart. The Camorra couldn't cope with the way Naples was modernizing. They could wear beige gloves, but they couldn't hide the scars on their faces. Camorra legend has it that shortly after Cuocolo's sentencing, on the evening of May 25, 1915, the few remaining members of the Camorra met in a basement bar in the Rione Sanita district and dissolved the Honored Society for good. By the outbreak of World War I, the word Camorra had all but disappeared from use. New songs about the Naples underworld began to speak of bandits called guapi, associated with personal achievements in the crime in one's neighborhood rather than of a whole criminal sect. The advent of fascism in 1922 effectively ended the urban Camorra in Naples, forcing the remaining criminals to lurk in the suburban areas of Campania. Mussolini's totalitarian regime destroyed organized illegal activity and harshly suppressed it where it was suspected. On May 26, 1927, Benito Mussolini made one of the most important speeches of his life, the Ascension Day speech, as it was called. In it, he declared that the end of the rule of organized crime within Italy was inevitable. Until 1932, unprecedented eradication measures had been taken, effectively driving criminals into remote rural corners. But then the Deuce was no longer concerned with criminals. The cult of militarism and preparations for imperialist war had taken over. Thus, by the beginning of World War II, many former Camorristas who had migrated to nearby villages had come to control the fruit and vegetable markets, tobacco production, and the harbor trade. In other words, they were also able to integrate into the fascist power system while still retaining a small sphere of influence. There was no talk of a final victory over organized crime, as Mussolini had promised. In 1935 to 1942, for 7 whole years, Italian armies took part in World War II and sowed death and destruction in Ethiopia, Albania, France, Greece, and Russia. In 1943, death and destruction struck back at the peninsula with a vengeful fury. On July 25th, Mussolini was arrested and the Allies had already landed in Sicily. For a whole year, Italy became a battlefield, plunged into another chaotic episode of its history, in which, as we know, the main players are always the most cunning and unscrupulous. The war and subsequent liberation provoked the emergence of a huge black market. This again played into the hands of Naples' geographic position. During most of the war in Italy, it was the most important port of entry for the arrival of a huge amount of food for Allied armies. This flow was both the city's deliverance and its curse. By April 1944, a staggering amount, nearly 45% of the military cargo of weapons and food, had been stolen. The illiterate Neapolitan guapi who lorded over their streets were making such enormous profits that they couldn't even count them. It got to the point where the sacks of money were weighed. I mean literally. One might say, I pay 3 kilograms of banknotes for 1,000 lire. In the war's devastation, class distinctions became meaningless, and those who could grab the biggest piece of the money pie were in power, even if they couldn't count it. The most famous black market was Via Forcella, where everything stolen from the Allies was displayed in the open air. If you knew how and who to ask, you could also buy weapons. Among the names of famous guapi were Giuliano, Pio Vittorio, and Salvatore, who in those days stood in for the Camorra. The year 1943 was ground zero for a new era of development for the Naples Honored Society. Experience gained during the liberation period would provide the new generation with answers to questions that their predecessors had failed to address, but that was the urban branch of the Camorra. After the Allies' withdrawal and until well into the 1950s, the village Camorristas consolidated their position in the Campania countryside, regulating the supply of vegetables, fruits, and other agricultural products. By this time, Italy had finally overcome the post-war crisis and people were able to eat well. About 30% of Italy's fruit and vegetable exports passed through the Neapolitan wholesale market at the Vasto. While other parts of Italy could provide seasonal trade in 1 or 2 specialized crops, Naples' super fertile hinterland grew every conceivable food plant in abundance year-round. The fresh tomatoes, zucchini, potatoes, peaches, and lemons coming from the region each year were worth about 16 billion lire, about $300 million in today's prices. Another 12 billion liras, 220 million USD, came from walnuts, hazelnuts, peanuts, raisins, figs, and other dried fruits. However, despite all its wealth, the Naples wholesale market was a sad sight. Rows of dilapidated hangars, destroyed during the war with trucks of goods crowded into rows. The market was served by a few shabby offices, a post office, and a couple of bank branches in the surrounding streets. There were no teleprinters or telephones. Deals, however large, were made the old-fashioned way, on the street sidewalks with Campani wholesalers who came in expensive sports cars from their villages. In 1955, the forgotten word Camorra again timidly appeared in the press, and the occasion was, of course, a high-profile murder and the subsequent trial which would come to be known as the New Camorra Trial. Pasquale Simonetti, one of the wholesalers at the Vasto market, was from the small town of Nola near Naples. Pasquale had a sturdy build and was tall, which is why he was nicknamed Big Pasquale from Nola. On the morning of July 16, 1955, Big Pasquale was shot twice by an unknown assailant. He was taken to the hospital and later died of blood loss. Such stories in the countryside were not uncommon, and had he not been killed in the center of Naples, it's likely that no one would have paid attention except the local paper. But Neapolitan journalists started digging and found many interesting facts. Thus, Pasquale enjoyed the fame of a notorious smuggler and was repeatedly brought to court for criminal acts, but this was to be expected. However, his young wife caught more attention. The young widow named Assunta Maresca was expecting a child from Pasquale. In the family, she was called Pupetta, which means doll, and this nickname suited her very well. She gave touching interviews in which she talked about their deep feelings for each other. And on October 4th, 1955, 2.5 months after the murder of her beloved, pregnant Pupetta arrived with a personal driver to the wholesale market in Naples. Another well-known fruit and vegetable merchant, Antonio Esposito, known as Big Tony from Pomigliano, was there at the time. Apparently, an argument broke out, during which Pupetta's driver fled, and then a shootout ensued. Pupetta's Fiat was shot several times through, and the inconsolable widow fired a Beretta from the back seat before running out of the car and fleeing. Big Tony from Pomigliano caught 5 bullets and died. During the investigation, Pupetta attracted a lot of attention. The whole country was waiting for new photos of the misfortunate young beauty and trying to unravel the true reasons for the murder. In court, she stated, "I killed for love," and admitted she had shot Big Tony of Pomigliano, who she believed had conspired with another traitor, Antonio Tosio, known by his nickname The Boss, to eliminate Big Pasquale. Big Pasquale told her this on his deathbed. For the sentimental part of the public, it was a love story. But for the more savvy, it was a prosaic gang war for power. The newspapers in the north began a full-scale debate about the new Camorra. Gradually, Pupetta's true colors began to emerge. First, it remained unclear how many people were involved in the shooting. The fact surfaced that in the car, in addition to the fleeting driver, was Pupetta's 16-year-old brother, Ciro, who she was very worried about. The ballistic examination was inconclusive. The place had been strewn with gunshot marks since the war, and there was no way to establish the truth. The prosecution suggested that Pupetta may well have led a firing squad that came to target Big Tony. Second, Pupetta was asked directly if her family had a nickname. She dodged the question for a while, but then proudly replied, "They call my family I Lampetelli," which means the glittering blades. The Maresca family, known for its brutality, and its nickname was in keeping with the Camorra clan's glorious criminal past. Third, despite her youth, Pupetta had already been in trouble with the law for violence, but the victim had somehow withdrawn her report. Fourth, it turned out that shortly before the murders there had been a dinner for 50 guests attended by both Big Pasquale and Big Tony, apparently to make a deal, but obviously something had gone wrong. The Pupetta case exposed to the Italian citizens a new world of organized crime that was essentially nothing new. The alliance between Pupetta and Big Pasquale was the union of an old criminal clan with a promising guapo, and the world of Campanian fruit traders was ruled not by family passions, as Pupetta wanted to show the public, but by cold calculation and criminal diplomacy. And her testimony further lifted the veil of secrecy over how village business was conducted. She called Big Pasquale the president of potato prices. He was the man who determined the wholesale price of potatoes at the market. Big Tony of Pomigliano was also described as a price president. Each of them controlled the supply of a particular type of vegetable, and they met regularly in the market to negotiate with each other. For buyers, this inefficient arrangement was a guarantee of constant prices and uninterrupted supply. In exchange for his services, for example, Big Pasquale received a bonus of 100 lire for every 100 kilos of potatoes. According to testimony, he could set up 50 truckloads of potatoes to the market per day, equivalent to about 1.65 million pounds, and thus earn up to $12,000 in 2012 prices on a good day. And that doesn't take into account the profits from extorting farmers. Later it became known that the new Camorra occupied more than the niche of vegetables. The livestock market was also in their department, and its center was also located in Nola. Thus, in the mid-50s, a new image of the Camorra emerged. Most of the respectable people who came under the investigation had luxurious homes, servants, bodyguards. They had restaurants, luxury cars, and personal tailors. Pasquale's own uncle, who served 20 years in the United States, spent his time losing large sums of money in casinos, while Pasquale's killer was the son of the former mayor of his town and ran a perfectly legal business in several Italian cities. Pupetta eventually received an 18-year sentence for the premeditated murder of Big Tony from Pomigliano. Several feature films would be made about her, and in the 80s, she would be played by Mussolini's granddaughter. So in the 50s, the Camorristas had not yet accumulated enough money or influence to regulate anything more than potato prices. It was a business without offices, based only on verbal agreements. Nevertheless, the Camorra's operations were already large-scale and, as in the previous century, could not develop without some political protection. In parallel, during this period, the urban Camorristas began to gradually increase their influence in smuggling. In 1961, the free port of Tangier in North Africa, through which the main tobacco smuggling traffic passed, was closed, and Naples was again the main gateway not only to Italy, but to Europe as a whole. The city did not yet possess a strong criminal organization capable of strangling competitors. and so smugglers of all stripes instantly flowed into Naples, from Sicily to Genoa, Corsica, and Marseille. But it was the Sicilian mafia that changed the rules of the smuggling game, both in general and for the Camorra in particular. Because of the high level of competition, only those who modernized their schemes, who had established connections with maritime trading companies, owned fast boats, and paid officials on land, were now on top. Smuggling was no longer an amateurish endeavor, and turf wars had begun. The Camorra at that point was under pressure from the Sicilians and Marseillese. The former were recruiting large Camorrista into the mafia, while the latter were afraid to do business with Neapolitans who were too close to mafiosi. In the early 1970s, after a long struggle, the Sicilians squeezed the French out of the market. Shortly before that, the US conducted a successful operation called the French Connection, which hurt the Marseillais and deprived them of their heroin factories. And so by the mid-1970s, the Italians finally took possession of the Neapolitan smuggling and drug markets. During this time, strong family ties developed between mafiosi and the Camorristas, based on dynastic marriages in Camporristico, the tradition of baptizing children where the godfather literally became a member of the family. The major Naples smugglers were officially initiated into the mafia. At least 2 mafia families in Campania that would play a role in the future were created and authorized by Palermo. One was based in the city itself and clustered around the large Zasa Mozzarella family, including Mad Mike Zasa. The other was based in Marano, a small town on the northern outskirts of Naples. Marano was home to the man who shot Big Pasquale from Nola in 1955. The killer's relatives, the Nuvoletta brothers, now ran the town and were initiated into the mafia. So the new mafia families in Campania inherited the 2 main criminal traditions of Naples. Mad Mike Zaza represented the city's Camorra, revitalized by the black market during World War II. Nuvoletta clan were the kinds of Camorrista who had long been involved in controlling supply routes from the countryside to the urban markets. So in a way, the opening of mafia affiliates in Campania was also a very significant return to the past. For the first time since the old honored society of Naples, a single organizational structure encompassed both urban and rural Camorras. The expanding trade in smuggled cigarettes and the close ties between the Sicilian and Neapolitan underworlds favored the Mafia Camorra. And yet, for another time in history, the very beginning of the word Camorra had undergone a transformation. Once upon a time, if used at all, it referred to small local gangs, smuggling networks, or even individual guapo. Now the Camorristas were increasingly becoming functionaries of much larger groups with a wide range of criminal activity and greater financial sophistication. The alliance was a resounding success. According to one estimate, in the late 1970s, the annual turnover of the illegal cigarette business in Campania was about 48.6 billion lire, about $215 million according to 2012 estimates, with net profits somewhere between 20 and 24 billion lire, or 88 to 106 million USD. In 1977, the Carabinieri found Mad Mike Zaza with a ledger showing that tobacco smuggling by the Mafia Camorra was bringing in a staggering 150 billion lire a year, over $620 million. Between 40,000 and 60,000 people in the Campania region are thought to have found work in the smuggling economy. But for the Sicilians, the Neapolitans did not become their equals. While the mafiosi were meticulous in enforcing all the laws, the Camorristi, who grew up on the streets of Naples, had a hard time keeping up with the prestige of the organization. Mad Mike and other Neapolitan smugglers never lost their reputation as slippery men among the mafia. According to mafioso and informant Tommaso Buscetta, they had a rough mentality and were prone to trickery. In 1978, the tobacco smuggling boom slowed as an international agreement allowed authorities to pursue smugglers in international waters. Cigarette seizures peaked that year. But by this time, heroin smuggling was opening a new, more lucrative, and far more divisive chapter in the history of Italy's underworld. Thus, in the decade from the 70s to the 80s, there were global changes in the organization and structure of the Camorra. First, the separation of the urban and rural Camorra, which operated in parallel but nevertheless together, was upheld. Second, the Camorristas established strong ties with Sicily. Third, they mastered the smuggling trade on a new level, which was impossible without a connection to the political sphere of a completely different level. In the 1970s, Italy's post-war economic miracle had worn off and the country entered a protracted crisis. The South again entered a period of decline after massive industrialization, urbanization, and mass migration to the region. Naples became even bigger than it had been, and was once again a self-reliant city with hepatitis epidemics every year and cholera in 1973. Unemployment was on the rise, as was the population's distrust of the government. The government at this time was a typical convoluted system in which decisions were made by deputies from different factions, the main one being the Christian Democratic Party. The Camorra, which needed to launder the ever-increasing profits from drug smuggling, fit into this system. The new Camorra took into account the mistakes of the 19th century. Modern gangs began to diversify too rapidly. They bought large tracts of land, supplied government agencies with fruits and vegetables, built food processing plants, ran horse farms, created construction companies, and built residential neighborhoods, ran nightclubs and illegal gambling establishments, and controlled the drug trade. This period was also characterized by the emergence of a new face in the field of Campanian crime, without whose acquaintance it's impossible to continue this story. This was Raphael Cutolo. By the way, if you want, we can make a separate video about this guy. He became the creator of perhaps the largest criminal organization in the history of Italy, Nuova Camorra Organizzata, the New Organized Camorra. Police estimate that at its peak in 1980, Nuova Camorra Organizzata, or NCO, had 7,000 members. Cutolo spent almost his entire life behind bars. His prison career began in 1963, when at the age of 21 he was sentenced to 24 years in prison for shooting a man. Cutolo intentionally tried to run over 4 women while braking at the last moment. A passing firefighter stood up for them, to which Cutolo silently pulled out a Beretta and shot the man. The aggravating factor was that Cutolo waited for the wounded man to waddle to the nearest shelter before walking over and discharging a full clip at him. Prison psychiatrists characterized him as a pathologically violent man. In 1970, Cuocolo was released pending a Supreme Court ruling in his case and became involved in extortion and cocaine. A year later, he was sent to the infamous Poggio Real prison for a shootout with the Carabinieri, and it was there that Cuocolo began to build his empire. By 1974, he had already earned the nickname King of Poggio Real and was involved in a major drug trafficking network. By 1977, he had enough influence that he was moved to the more cozy setting of the state mental hospital in Aversa near Naples. In February 1978, his men blew up the hospital wall with TNT and he broke free. However, at the end of 1979, he found himself behind bars again, continuing to run his organization directly from prison. Operating from prison, Cutolo perfected the win-win methods used by the prison Camorra since the early 19th century. Cutolo's nickname was the Professor. While incarcerated, he reread every available book on the old Camorra. In essence, to the lost youth of a depressed Naples, bunching up in gangs, Cutolo offered the same thing as his predecessors had: to feel part of the system, but it was based on friendship and honor. He borrowed many of the rituals from the 'ndrangheta who sat with him, and kept the traditions of the past, because the 'ndrangheta, as you may recall, had once been part of the old prison Camorra, and also descended from one of the Spanish brothers. There was a real cult of personality behind the professor in the NCO, which he skillfully maintained. Cutolo wrote unpretentious poems and essays in which he reflected on honor, friendship, and omerta, and romanticized the image of a heroic death for a common cause. And indeed, during the heyday of the NCO, thousands of its soldiers did not hesitate to go to their deaths for it. Members of Cutolo's organization called themselves non-commissioned officers. The NCO engaged in all kinds of illegal business, from drug trafficking and truck hijacking to stealing European Economic Community agricultural subsidies and inflating government construction projects, but extortion remained their main instrument of influence. Cutolo's racket was run by confidants, including his older sister Rosetta, who was one of the Camorra's most powerful female bosses. In 1978, Cuocolo sent his non-commissioned officers into a battle that turned into the bloodiest crime war in Naples history, the war against the Sicilian Mafia. After his noisy escape from the mental institution, the professor recruited hundreds of more young followers, reorganized his command structure, greatly strengthened his racketeering system, and charged all other Camorra organizations. They had to pay a tax of 20,000 lire for every case of smuggled cigarettes unloaded in the region. This meant only one thing: he claimed to be the absolute ruler of Campania's entire crime world. And all of this was flavored with historical pathos in the professor's own style. The Nuova Camorra Organizzata, heir to the traditions of the Neapolitan honored society of old, was to lead a crusade to liberate the region from Sicilian influence. The Sicilians with their mafia were an obstacle to prosperity. The first pro-mafia clans to unite against Cuocolo were those from central Naples. They called themselves Nuova Famiglia, New Family, but they can be referred to simply as NF. By early 1980, the whole region was divided between two armed camps, the NF and the NCO. The scale of the armies was absolutely unprecedented in the long history of Campanian organized crime. So too was the scale of the bloodshed. Some 1,000 people died in 5 years. The Campania battle in the early 1980s was very confusing because Nuova Famiglia was a loose alliance rather than a single entity. It was affected by many factors. Some members left the game, joined alliances, broke up, died, and were pressured from the outside by the Mafia. The structure of NF can be generally traced back to its two central members, the Giuliano and Nuvoletta clans, which represented two types of Camorra business operations that are still characteristic today. The Giulianos, residents of a posh house on Via Forcella in the corner of Naples, were lovers of ostentatious luxury that traced back to the velvet camisoles and gold chains of their predecessors. The family's career began in the black markets after the war. Their means of making money were urban: betting, Napoli game tickets, drug dealing, stealing, counterfeiting, and roofing of every kind imaginable. And the area north of town was home to a quieter group of Camorristas, who also became part of the NF. This was Merano, a small agricultural center long favored by the Camorra. It was where Big Pasquale's killer was from, as you may recall. In the 1970s and 80s, Merano was ruled by his relatives Lorenzo, Gaetano, Angelo, and Ciro Nuvoletta, who became fabulously wealthy during the tobacco smuggling boom. Their farmhouse, surrounded by trees, was the site of all the most important meetings during the war between Cutolo and the NF. The Nuvolettas favored a low-key public image. Their wealth was vast and balanced on the border between legitimate business and crime. The clan made money from construction and smuggling, properties and extortion, agriculture and fraud. In this way, Nuova Famiglia reflected all the traditional diversity of Naples' organized crime. In 1980, another major event occurred in the history of the modern Camorra, the earthquake of November 23rd, whose epicenter was in the mountains east of Naples. It killed 2,914 people in Campania. This tragic event was a real breakthrough for the Camorra, and in particular for Raphael Cutolo's organization. At the height of the war for power, he strategically broke into the construction business, thus merging with the political class. A typical motive of Italian socialism was to distribute numerous allowances, pensions, and contracts to the South instead of addressing the housing and needs of the citizens. All of these funds were dispersed through the network of corruption, and little was left for the really serious matters requiring investment. The earthquake exposed Campania's ills. Prestigious new buildings built with central government money collapsed like cardboard houses. An entire wing of a public hospital in the village of Sant'Angelo de Lombardi collapsed to the ground, killing dozens of people. Obviously, in this, as in many other cases, distributing contracts and jobs to the right people was a higher priority than building a sturdy building to code. Funding streams poured into the post-earthquake reconstruction of Campania. Avid politicians rushed to cash in. The number of city rebuilding boards grew, and the number of emergency buildings steadily increased. Looking ahead, by 1990, 10 years after the earthquake, 28,572 of the approximately 50,000 people affected were still living in emergency vans. Naturally, Camorristas of all factions could not stay away from such a lucrative piece of action. The episode that revealed the Camorra's connection to construction was the Cirillo case. Ciro Cirillo, a Christian Democrat, assumed responsibility for managing the huge funds sent by the government for reconstruction of Campania. Shortly thereafter, on the evening of April 27, 1981, he was kidnapped by a Neapolitan branch of the Red Brigades, an Italian extreme left organization. This was far from the first political assassination attempt by the radical left, and everyone knew exactly what was coming next. A call taking responsibility for the kidnapping and demanding a ransom. Cirillo was a central character in the underhanded machinations and knew many secrets, so his candidacy was not at all accidental. The radicals were opening the eyes of citizens deprived by the earthquake to the greed of politicians. Cirillo's chances of surviving the ordeal were slim. The authorities had an official policy of refusing to negotiate with political kidnappers. In June, the People's Court of the Red Brigades handed Cirillo a death sentence. He was doomed like the previous abductees, but on July 24, 1981, Cirillo was released, and the Brigadistas announced that they had received a ransom of 1,450,000 lire. The Minister of the Interior indignantly rejected the version that states Cirillo was released for money, saying that he had been released without negotiation. Over the next 12 years, the shocking truth about the high-profile kidnapping and the miraculous release of someone as important as Cirillo would slowly emerge. As you may have guessed by now, the authorities went into negotiations not with the radical left, but with their usual friends, specifically Raphael the Professor Cutolo's Nuovo Camorra Organizada. The story goes something like this. 16 hours after Cirillo's disappearance, Raphael Cutolo received a visit from several people at the prison, a secret agent of domestic intelligence, a local mayor from Cirillo's faction, and Vincenzo the Black One Castillo, the military chief of the NCO and Cutolo's right-hand man. The outcome of this conversation was a prisoner negotiation between the leaders of the Red Brigades, Cuocolo, and the state representatives. Castillo continued to fight in Naples territory this whole time. Eventually, the ransom was paid and the valuable Cirillo was released. Cirillo's case demonstrated the depth of the Italian state's decline in the 1980s. The organs of the state negotiated with leftist terrorists through the friendly services of the country's largest criminal organization. The negotiations involved a long list of names ranging from intelligence agents to petty Camorristas. So what did Cutolo get? Apart from the respect, the state turned to him for help, transferred him again to even more lenient conditions, and he got a piece of pie on the plate of reconstruction after the earthquake. No direct evidence of this was found, but the investigation proved that businessmen close to the NCO, including the professor's son Roberto, received contracts worth 67 billion lire to build houses in the town of Avellino. Other Camorristas had a hand in earthquake reconstruction, even before the Cirillo campaign began. On December 11, 1980, just 2.5 weeks after the earthquake, the mayor of one affected town near Naples was shot dead because he had tried to prevent companies linked to organized crime from getting contracts to clear the rubble. The earthquake thus added another dimension to the confrontation between Nuova Camorra Organizada and Nuova Famiglia. However, the Cirillo case proved decisive in another respect. It led to the final defeat of Raphael Professor Cutolo. Cuocolo had now become someone who knew too much and was a liability. On March 18, 1982, 11 months after Cirillo's kidnapping, an alleged Interior Ministry document appeared in a communist newspaper with full details about the negotiations leading to Cirillo's release. The letter turned out to be forged, but much of the details were true, the kind of truth that led to an official investigation into Cirillo's release and negotiations. Most likely, the author of this opus was the professor, who wanted to warn the greedy authorities. If they didn't give him what he wanted, he would tell everything. But things turned out quite differently from what he had envisioned. From the comfort of his lobster and champagne diet, he was instantly escorted to an island prison, where he lost operational contact with his connects. Back on the peninsula, the NF began a mop-up operation. First, they eliminated the construction entrepreneur who ran the NCO's business wing, and then they struck at the invaluable Vincenzo Castillo, Cutolo's warlord. In January 1983, Castillo was blown to pieces in a booby-trapped car bombing in Rome. These actions by the NF had a double meaning. First, to demonstrate to Cuocolo that he was finished, and second, to end political blackmail and show the authorities that the NF was not under the NCO at all, and certainly would not blackmail anyone. The young NCO followers were quickly finished off by NF militants, and the Nuova Camorra effectively ceased to exist. Although the professor overestimated his own power, his influence on the development of the Camorra cannot be overstated. During his reign, the Camorra reached a level of wealth and influence that could be compared to the powers of Calabria and Sicily. The professor was one of the main reasons why Italy witnessed the birth of two entirely new criminal organizations. The NF, in the form of united clans, having got the region in their hands, promptly started an internal war, and the first battles took place in Murano, home of the Nuvoletta clan. On June 10, 1984, 4 cars raced through the center of Murano, fiercely firing machine guns and pistols at each other, and a random passerby was killed. The Carabinieri followed the path of the cars, arrived at the Nuvoletta's estate. The house was riddled with machine guns, and in the garden lay the corpse of the youngest brother, Ciro. The attack was carried out by Antonio Bardellino of San Cipriano di Aversa, a town near Murano. Bardellino was a successful fighter from the Nuvoletta clan. But during the war with the NCO, their views had diverged. At the instance of the Mafia, the Nuvolettas did not actively join the fight against the professor, while Bardellino's unit took the brunt of the attack. The Nuvoletta's intention was to wait until the professor and Bardellino had defeated each other, giving them the opportunity to take over. When Bardellino realized that war with the Nuvolettas was inevitable, he returned home from his drug trafficking base in Mexico specifically to lead his men in this attack. and after their success, returned back, leaving the campaign against the Nuvoletas in the hands of his main ally, Carmine Alfieri, simply known as the Angry One. Alfieri was from Nola and was invited to join the NCO at the beginning of the war. When he declined, the professor killed his brother. After that, the Angry One joined forces with the NF. Alfieri proved to be even more ruthless than Bardolino. His first major attack on Nuvoleta's allies was one of the most brutal murders in Italian gang history. In late August 1984, a shabby tourist bus stopped on a main street near a fishing club, and 14 hitmen got out. Armed with assault rifles, shotguns, and pistols, they calmly walked down the steps of the bus and began shooting at men playing cards. 8 men were killed in all. The club, it turned out, was a regular meeting place for the Nuvoleta's local allies, the Gionta clan, whose leader was another Camorrista initiated into the mafia. It was such a painful blow to the prestige of the mafiosi that many Sicilians prepared to shut down their businesses in Campania. The war against the Nuvoletas made angry Alfieri the most powerful Camorrista in Campania. But he learned the lessons of both sides, the Sicilians and the professor, and neither tried to impose centralized control nor a cult of personality. The Camorra under Alfieri became a confederation, as his capo later explained. Everyone remained autonomous. We were not like the Sicilian mafia. Each group had its own bosses, and he could act in the way that benefited his business. Alfieri's rule provided some balance to the Campania's volatile environment, although the map of organized crime in the region did become more fragmented. In 1983, at the end of the war between Nuova Camorra Organizzata and Nuova Famiglia, there were 12 Camorra organizations in Campania. 5 years later, in 1988, there were 32. However, the fragmentation of some clans in the mid-1980s did not mean that the Camorra as a whole became less powerful. On the contrary, this territorial fragmentation helped the Camorristas penetrate deeper into the political and economic systems. By 1987, Italy had entered another period of economic prosperity and was experiencing a boom in consumption, but that's one side of it. On the other, tax evasion was widespread, and in the South, as always, the chronic problems of administrative inefficiency, low skills in education, and lack of inward investment persisted. Unregulated, untaxed business was everywhere. Italy's public debt rose inexorably. In the 1980s, although the South was by no means the only region responsible. The main culprits of the debt were the usual suspects, the state and the political system that was supposed to manage it. The old vices of cronyism and the protectorate politics intensified in the 80s, partly because there were fewer constraints. Endless party competition for favorable seats hampered the executive branch. A new breed of business politician emerged. The party functionary or public administrator who systematically took bribes on government contracts and spent them on nice cars and expensive suits. For such politicians, the Camorristas were just another faction whose support could be enlisted in the struggle to monopolize state resources. Organized crime became an indispensable ally, and the line between criminal and legitimate business had never been so blurred. This became especially evident in the notorious construction sector, where every major clan had investments in the form of lucrative cement plants. Paying bribes became routine, as did handing out large subcontracts. Entire cities were rebuilt with Camorra money and without a single construction license. According to a report by the Parliamentary Inquiry, Naples had become a metropolis that could only be compared to some in South America or Southeast Asia. It was uninhabitable and impossible to travel through. Houses built in such a way have a devastating long-term potential. Their unfortunate residents or the companies based in the illegal construction areas are totally dependent on the favor of those who own the buildings. Alfieri's territorial control around his hometown of Nola was so unchallenged that no one would dream of entering into a contract except through his offices. All the goods of the modern criminal empire flowed through Alfieri's hands: bribes and votes, drugs and concrete, contracts and weapons. And there were 32 such gangs throughout Campania. By 1992, that number had risen to 108. According to the most recent estimates, there are still about 100 major criminal organizations in Campania, where criminal activity has become entrenched but unstable. Camorra clans come and go, merge and dissolve, fight and make alliances. In Campania, the lines of Camorra power are constantly shifting on the map. Police make arrests, wars erupt over spheres of influence, clans break up and merge. Increased violence is an inevitable consequence of this fundamental instability. The Camorra continues to kill more people than the Sicilian Mafia or the 'Ndrangheta. In recent years, there have been several major peaks in the murder rate from 1994 to 98. There were over 100 Camorra murders each year, and then again in 2004 and again in 2007. The world economic crisis of 2008 was a breeding ground for the Camorra because they're really rich, and in hard times, money calls the shots. In modern Italy, the Camorra is no longer associated with the slums of Naples on Via Forcella. They are responsible for perhaps one of the ugliest architectural projects in the suburb of Scampia, the Lavelle, that is, the Sales, housing complex. It's the worst housing project in Europe. In the 2000s, the Camorra turned the triangular high-rises of Lavelle into a drug-dealing mall. Built in the 60s and 70s, the complex was supposed to imitate the lively streets of downtown Naples, but in reality, it ended up being an ugly, confusing building, a labyrinth of corridors and interior rooms, as if specifically created to sell drugs. Moreover, it was poorly built. The elevators did not work, the concrete crumbled, and the roof leaked. These problems led Lavelle to slum status almost immediately after its creation. And when desperate refugees from the 1980 earthquake illegally occupied empty apartments, the few law-abiding citizens left in Lavelle found themselves literally in the heart of the drug trade. Police made rare visits to the Sales, and even rarer visits inside. As of now, after 20 years of controversy, Lavelle has finally been demolished, and its residents relocated to new homes. In the 1990s and 2000s, drug distribution in Lavelle was under the control of the Di Lauro clan. Its founder, Paolo Di Lauro, known as Ciruso the Millionaire. His base was in Secondigliano, a neighborhood near Scampia, on the northern outskirts of Naples that was originally a row of large, elegant 19th century houses lining the road out of town, but in the 1970s and 80s, it saw huge new housing developments. The millionaire headed a centralized organization set up to serve the needs of the drug trade. Among his closest aides were his two sons and son-in-law. Under their command were the so-called delegates, who were in charge of buying and wholesaling drugs. Everything below this top level of the clan was run by a kind of franchise system that kept risky and messy day-to-day business operations at bay. 20 zone chiefs were given the authority to manage sales in various areas of Millionaire's territory, as well as manage street dealers, scouts, and enforcers. About 200 were considered officially recognized members of the clan, but many more were employed. At the peak of Millionaire's power, it's estimated that the organization's drug revenues were $1.3 billion a year. In 2002, Millionaire was forced into hiding from the law, and control passed to his sons, who struggled to temper the ambitions of the organization's delegates. The result in the winter of 2004 to 2005 was the most brutal of the recent Camorra wars. Known as the First Scampia Feud, when the Di Lauro clan fought a breakaway faction called the Spaniards. Nearly 100 people, including women, were killed during this period. The second war in Scampia broke out in 2012, this time within the ranks of the Spaniards themselves. The Di Lauro clan is one of the most hierarchically structured Camorra organizations of the last generation. Its example shows the core of the modern Camorra structure. On the one hand, the Camorra clan needs a rigid command structure, especially for wars and the defense of territory. On the other hand, the clan also needs to be free enough for its bosses to network widely, taking advantage of any criminal opportunity that presents itself at home or abroad. Beyond these principles, a variety of structures are possible. The term Camorra has come to encompass anything from the drug-dealing street gangs found in the rundown neighborhoods of many western cities to large syndicates with ironclad ties to the political system and the legal economy. As with the Di Lauro clan, blood ties often help bind together the core members of any organization. Camorra bosses are often raised with family histories of violence and criminal prowess. Mixed marriages between Camorra bloodlines and neighboring territories help consolidate power and pass this skill from generation to generation. The notion of mastery comes from the prison system. A true criminal mastermind is always engaged in real criminal work, and nothing else. The importance of kinship within the Camorra clans helps to explain why women can take on frontline roles. The cases of Pupetta Maresca and the professor's older sister, Raphael Cutolo, tell us that even before the 1990s, some Camorra women were more prominent than Sicilian or Calabrian women. But in the last 2 decades, women in the Camorra have become much more visible. There are 2 reasons for this. First, the crime bosses have shed the old prejudices that made them blind to the criminal talents of women. Second, because of increased police pressure, clans have delegated more power to women when their men go into hiding or behind bars. Neither Sicily nor Calabria have seen anything like the brutal battle that unfolded between the women of Graciano and Cava clans in 2002. On May 26th of that year, a Graziano firing squad, which included 3 women, pursued and rammed a car carrying 5 Cava women. In the carnage, 4 of the Cava women were shot dead and the 5th was left paralyzed. On both the victim's side and the perpetrator's side, several generations of women were involved, mothers, daughters, and even a grandmother. The Camorra, unique among Italian and even world organized crime, also allowed sexual minorities to take the lead. Anna Terracciano is one of 12 siblings from the Spanish quarters of Naples, 11 of whom are active in organized crime, known as a masculona, something like big macho. Anna is a lesbian who has participated in military actions on behalf of her clan. She was imprisoned in 2006. 3 years later, police arrested Ugo Gabriel, who authorities say is the first registered transgender Camorrista. Known as Ketty, Gabriel was a younger brother in one of the clans that broke away from the Millionaires' organization during the 04-05 Scampia feud. According to police, when her brother was promoted, Ketty moved away from selling cocaine to her clients. She was a prostitute and took a more managerial role in the drug business. In addition to the Camorra's resilience on family ties, Ketty's promotion may have also had something to do with Neapolitan popular culture's traditional tolerance of trans women, the so-called femminili. The modern Camorra operates on the same principles as a century and a half before, with a few exceptions. First, each faction has its own territory, and as of now, there's no longer any need to fight over them, as everything is priorly distributed. And because of the complete physical control of a territory, there's been a tendency to concentrate on specific activities such as drug distribution, illegal gambling, selling cigarettes, and so on. Second, the Camorra continues to target young recruits. If the Mafia is like Medusa, the Camorra is the Hydra, with 2 new tentacles growing from each severed one. The young and bold are eager to get rich quick, and the Camorra is ready to give them their chance. Third, they still do good old-fashioned racketeering and selling protection of all kinds. In the case someone refuses protection on their territory, the Camorristas can make the store of a fundamentally honest citizen a transit point for drug addicts. For example, in the microwave of one cafe, bar girls had several kilos of heroin, and this is one of hundreds of ways criminal workers are capable of influence. Fourth, traditional activities such as underground casinos, betting, and usury are still relevant today. Fifth, there are groups nowadays that deal only with government contracts, and they are very successful. This is the Camorra in beige gloves, which incarnated in the 20th century. It's rumored that the average tax for mediation is 20% of the contract received. And of course, the biggest profit item is the Camorra's participation in an international drug trafficking network, which requires a separate video to tell the story. By the way, if you want to see it, write in the comments. One specific method of the Camorra drug trade, unlike all other major criminal groups, is the use of entire families in its distribution network. Adults usually negotiate the price and receive the money, while their underage children deliver the goods. The growth of drug trafficking, money laundering, and rapid overall increase in the Camorra's strength in recent years has led to a larger presence abroad. Over the past 2 decades, the world economic and political systems have become much more globalized and integrated, and the actions of major criminals have accordingly also become more integrated, as they're adapting to changing conditions. Given the complex international nature of drug trafficking and money laundering, a high-level criminal operating in only one country is likely to be displaced by those who attempt to exploit resources and opportunities on a global scale. The economic and social power of the Camorra means that it's hugely profitable, recycling vast sums of money into the legal economy and directly or indirectly providing jobs and livelihoods for up to 500,000 people. As one of Naples' leading police officers observed, the Camorra has probably become more dangerous than the Mafia because organized crime in Campania is so widespread that it's almost impossible to eradicate. Given that it's not a monolithic group like the Mafia, where you find the boss and his deputy, decapitate the strongest gang, and the rest get disoriented. On the contrary, here in Campania, you decapitate one and the rest stay and take his place. Clearly, the creation of such power could never have been achieved without the support and convenience of local politicians, the very people entrusted with solving the problem of organized crime. And surely no account of the modern Camorra would be complete without a visit to the vast fertile plain north of the city, sometimes called Terra di Lavoro, the land of labor, which has been the scene for some of the most important events in Campania's organized crime history over the past century and a half. Nowadays, the once fertile and beautiful land has become a veritable Italian Chernobyl. In 1994, when Italy's Second Republic was born, Naples and Campania were in the midst of a garbage crisis. The landfills were overflowing and people living near them were starting to get sick. The government appointed a commission to tackle the problem, but delays began. In 1996, it was decided to give the Garbage Commission the power to bypass usual planning restrictions and local government controls to put the plan into action. On paper, the plan looked smooth, step-by-step sorting and recycling of garbage by collecting it, separating it to screen out hazardous substances, then shredding and compacting it into so-called eco-bales that could be used as fuel. 7 eco-bale plants and 2 new incinerators were to be built. It was claimed that once these were up and running, Campania would have a perfect cycle of environmentally friendly waste collection and reuse. But the solution to Campania's garbage problem quickly turned into an environmental disaster. The garbage cycle was a failure at every stage. By the end of 2007, only one of the incinerators had been built. Plans to build a second one were finally canceled in 2012, but it would be better if they had not been built at all. The locations were chosen extremely poorly. The first one was located a few hundred yards from a children's hospital, and the second one, which never left the page, was planned to be built in a place where there were already so many dumps that animals were dying around it. Later, it turned out that the incinerator they built was not working well and spreading poisonous gases within a 6-mile radius. Things were even worse with the 7 eco-bale plants. The cubes were compacted, unsorted garbage in plastic packaging, which, when burned, emitted an unknown amount of toxins into the air. Nothing could be done but to store them away from residential areas. Throughout Campania, gray and white towers of toxic trash cubes began to rise into the air. In 2004, the regional garbage commissioner told Parliament that 40,000 square meters of land was being used to store eco-bales every month. Periodically in the early years of the 21st century, the failing waste disposal system in Campania was completely backed up. During the worst period from 2007 to 2008, hundreds of thousands of tons of garbage from homes and stores piled up on the streets. The authorities responded by opening landfills that were already considered overcrowded. Local residents, justifiably concerned about the impacts of their quality of life, staged angry protests. News cameras from around the world broadcast pictures of both the garbage mountains and the protests, causing incalculable damage to the reputation of Naples, Campania, and Italy. The Camorristas entered the construction business later than their neighbors, but they were ahead of the curve with garbage. Eco-mafia is a term coined by Italian environmentalists to describe the damage the underworld is doing to Italy's natural and other resources, from illegal construction to trading agricultural goods. The waste sector is the eco-mafia's most lucrative activity and one of the biggest areas of growth in criminal enterprises over the past 2 decades. The failure of garbage reform is entirely their fault. The Camorra infiltrated the waste system in various ways and at all levels, from collection plants to protests over the administration of landfills. Those who disagreed were eliminated. Camorristas only cared about profits, they did not think about the consequences. Each link in the chain of collection and disposal was already barely working, and the monopolization of this sphere by the Camorra aggravated the situation, so that everything stopped working completely. Trash collection and disposal turned into an endless debate between government agencies on the topic, who is to blame and what to do. But the most alarming aspect was not even the eco-bales and unauthorized dumps. In the early 1990s, evidence began to emerge that the Camorra was illegally dumping millions of tons of toxic waste from hospitals and various industries into Terra di Lavoro, just north of Naples. Among the poisons found were asbestos, arsenic, lead, and cadmium. In other words, the problem was much deeper, and any attempt to solve it led back to the Camorra. This picture was confirmed by an investigation known as Operation Cassiopeia between 1999 and 2003, which revealed the huge profits the Camorristas were making from the garbage business and unauthorized dumping. One suspect owned 45 apartments and a hotel totaling $65 million. Many of the defendants at the Cassiopeia trial confessed, but the toxic waste is still in Campania, and the garbage issue remains a thorny one. The peak of the Naples garbage crisis of 2007 to 2008 coincided with the stunning success of a book that made the Camorra more famous worldwide than it had been since World War I, Gomorrah. The title is a play on words, was published in 2006 by a little-known 26-year-old writer and journalist named Roberto Saviano. Saviano hails from Casal di Principe, located in the heart of the most notorious part of Terra di Lavoro. After the overthrow of Carmine Angry Alfieri in 1992, the local Casalesi clan became the dominant force in the Camorra. After a bloody civil war, they took over the cocaine business and occupied the agricultural sector, establishing a monopoly on several well-known food brands. Ultimately, the Casalesi would also be the clan responsible for creating an Italian Chernobyl in their territory, offering disposal services for toxic waste that was simply poured into ditches. By September 2006, Gomorrah had already won awards and had tens of thousands of readers, especially among young people. Saviano returned to his hometown to take part in a demonstration defending the rule of law, and immediately came under the scrutiny of Casalesi's bosses, due to which he now lives under constant guard. You may have different opinions about Gomorrah, but it's turned the Camorra back into what it always was meant to be: a national scandal. It showed a new generation of campaigners what the Camorra is all about, even if in an overly dramatic way. And maybe it's the new generation that will finally find a way to deal with it.